In 1997, 25,000 readers here in the UK voted for their book of the century as we approached the end of the 20th century and the end of the millennium. I'm Jack, this is Spread Bookjoy, and I want to talk to you about that controversial list. And it's been prompted because recently there has been a list and then a subsequent list published in the New York Times. The first list was voted for by 503 authors, people like Marlon James and Stephen King, Min Jin Lee. New York Times requested them to tell them what their best books of the 21st century so far had been, and they took those votes and compiled it into a list which is supposed to be the best books of the 21st century so far. Of course, best is subjective, and then this prompted a huge spate of videos, some of which I'm going to link in the description box below because I thought they were brilliant. Shelley Swearingen has an amazing video where she talks about the list, but then she put a call out to YouTubers to vote for their book of the 21st century, and my lovely Gemma from Gem of Books, she put out a really good video about it, and everyone's been talking about this list, unpicking it, and isn't that the best thing when people start to debate books and start to talk about books and discover new books because of lists like this? Because of all the outpouring of controversial picks on this list, because lots of readers are like, where's this book, where's that book, why is there no poetry on the list, I think was one of the things that came up. The New York Times asked readers then to vote for their books of the 21st century so far. So they put out a second list, and the two lists I'm going to link in the description box below. If you haven't seen them, you probably have, because I'm like one of the last people to talk about this. Published a second list and they compared the two, and there were 39 books that were exactly the same and 61 books different. The top book on the authors list was Elena Ferrante's My Beautiful Friend. No, My Brilliant Friend. Yeah, I've got the book over there because I got it out of the library well before this list was published. It's been sat on my shelf and been renewed a couple of times. But yes, so My Brilliant Friend, and that was voted number 1. It was in the top 10 in the readers list. So I'm going to call one the authors list, the best books list, and the readers best books list. The readers best book was Demon Copperhead, which was only published last year and had won, I believe it won the Women's Prize, and did it win Pulitzer? I can't remember. You can see I'm not a prize list person. Yeah, Demon Copperhead had lots of plaudits and very well loved here on YouTube by friends of mine particularly, and I do have to read it. I've got it on my Kindle to read, but Demon Copperhead came out top. In the top 10, the only book that was in the same place, in the same position in the top 10 that I saw was Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, which is a book that I do want to read. I've had on my TBR for a long time, and I do love that author. The lists were really interesting. There was more genre fiction on the Reader's Choice list, I believe, and yeah, so it was just a really fascinating debate. And it just got me thinking and remembering back to when I was a bookseller in Waterstones in the late 90s, and we were approaching the turn of the century, the new millennium. So it wasn't just the turn of the century, it was the turn of the millennium as well. And we had this public vote instigated by Waterstones and by Channel 4, and 25,000 people voted. I've been looking everywhere to see how many readers voted in the New York Times readers poll, and I couldn't find a number anywhere. I do know 503 authors did the best books, the initial New York Times best books of the 21st century list. 25,000 members of the public voted in this survey, and it was believed at the time to be the most wide-ranging survey of its kind in the UK. And I know there was one conducted by the BBC at one point, but I think this one superseded it in terms of the numbers of people who voted. So I thought it was really interesting because there's been a lot of controversy around the New York Times list, but the 1997 Waterstones list was also, I remember, hugely controversial. And in my memory, I just remember there being quite a big outcry about the book that got number 1, that was picked as everyone's favourite of the 20th century. I've been thinking about these lists and what these lists are useful for, because of course they're subjective, and of course they're up for debate, because reading is subjective and it's also up for debate. And also, what is good and what is best, and what does they mean by the book of the century? What is the merit of the book of the century? And who decides what has merit? So yeah, I thought it was really interesting, but it was very fascinating to me that authors who write and are their written word is their bread and butter. They are artists. I believe they're artists, and they voted for a list of books that readers disagreed with. So it's really interesting. And it's not that authors aren't readers, but authors read differently from casual readers, you know. I think I'm more than casual in my reading, but I just mean people who read who don't also write for a living. So what makes a book the best for them in comparison to what makes a book the best for an author? It's really interesting to think about the people who voted. The list that I'm going to read to you, the 1997 list, I could only find online. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to research this because I've got my memories of this, because I remember the list came out and there was a lot of talk about it. There were, there was talk on the radio about it, on the TV about it. There were debates. There were critics talking about it. And because, of course, this is 1997. So if you didn't have a satellite dish, you only had terrestrial TV. We didn't have social media, all those kinds of things. So the debate was quite nationwide about it in terms of people who read. And we also had a big table in every branch of Waterstones where we had the book of the century and all the books that, the other 100 books on these tables for sale in a special promotion. I think it was like a 3 for 2 promotion, because book promotions were so much better back in the 90s. Now you like buy 4 get 1 half price or something. But yeah, we had a huge sale, and our sales of books really increased, particularly of the book that was voted the top book, or the book of the century, because that's what I believe they called the poll. I found one article still available online about this, and it was in The Guardian, and I will talk to you a bit about it at the end because it's got some facts about the list, and I don't want to spoil the list for you. I want to go through the list for you. And I found another, like a blog post or a post which was about something else. I can't talk about it without spoiling the list, but I'll talk to you about both of these things at the end, because I thought it's not just my memory that I'm relying on. You can find this list online. You can find it on Goodreads. You can find it on places where they do lists of books and notable lists and things like that. So I'm going to go through it with you now though, but I thought what we could do is maybe pause the video here and have a think, and you can put a post and you can say guess, and you can guess what the book that was voted the book of the 20th century by 25,000 people will be. And you can also put in there your vote. So I want you to put in your guess and your vote for what you would vote for the book of the 20th century. But what do these lists tell us? Because this is what I wanted to talk about before I go through the list. These lists are a snapshot of time. They are a real kind of like sociological snapshot of society, of, I believe, politics, of tastes, of culture, and also of an industry, publishing industry, which is incomparable to what it was in 1997. So just think back, 1997, we did not have e-readers, at least not in the way we have them now. People weren't reading via ebook. We did not have social media, so we didn't have BookTube, BookTok, all of these things. You went in a bookshop, you browsed, you might have bought the Times literary supplement, you might have read reviews in newspapers. People used to come in when I was at Waterstones with reviews of books they'd cut out of the newspaper because they wanted the book. It was a very different world. Harry Potter was published in 1997, so I can tell you now, it's not a spoiler, that does not feature on this list, but if we did a list now of people's best books of the 20th century, would Harry Potter feature? Possibly. It was a publishing phenomenon and beloved by millions of people. We won't talk about the author because I don't talk about them on this channel, but that book meant a lot to me. And I was an adult when it came out and I still loved it, and I loved the series. There are more children's books on this 20th century list, which I think speaks volumes about people's thoughts on literature and children's literature compared to now. And I think the ways we read and the ways that society has changed, and the way that we kind of are trying to boost and amplify diverse voices now, even though we're still nowhere near where we need to be, I think is far better. When you look at this list is very white, it is very male, and you'll also notice it's got a quite not a huge amount of translated fiction, but that also speaks to the time, not just the lack of diversity because of the sort of kind of male, white, Western dominated publishing industry, which it was, But also I think that the ways in which we consume books and the ways that we can find out about translated fiction through the internet, through things like BookTube, through avid readers who come on here, and I find a lot of my books I've never heard of through BookTube, and a lot of people find it through, I don't know, BookTok or whatever, however they find out about books. I feel like the online discussion around books enriches the pool of books that are published or people want to read, and the influx of different media for consuming books, so ebook, audio books are so readily available. We can stream books now. You know, back when I was younger, if you wanted an audio book, you had to buy big cassettes. You know, there'd be like 9 or 10 cassettes for like a decent sized book, and it would cost a fortune. It would cost an absolute fortune. Or CDs, it would cost an absolute fortune to get audiobooks. So yeah, the way we consume has changed everything, and I think the fact that things are more readily available, there are more indie authors can publish more readily now, much more respected than it used to be. It used to be called vanity publishing, so it tells you everything that we used to think about independently published things, and there are smaller presses now. So my point is, I suppose, I just think it's a really fascinating sociological thing to think about. If we did this list now, if we asked readers now, and people who remember the 20th century, there are plenty of them, I'm one of them, their books of the 20th century, and readers who read 20th century classics and literature, what do you think are the best books of the 20th century? What would that list look like now? Would it be more diverse? You know, would we have James Baldwin on there? You know, would we have Octavia Butler on there? Would we have more queer authors? You know, how diverse would this list be? Now, thinking about this list, what do you think of this New York Times list that's caused all this debate? In 25 years' time, will we be looking at it in the same way? And there's also a number of books that are on the list that I don't think people still talk about or read today necessarily in the same way they did then. Some of the books are on the list, I believe, because they were having a moment. Without further ado, I've talked about it enough. I'm really sorry. I didn't want to talk about it at such length, but it's an interesting topic. I'm going to read you the list, and I'm not going to stop and talk about everything on the list, but I might make a few comments about some of it. So, from 100 down to the top book, the best book, the book of the 20th century as voted for by these readers. At number 100, The Horse Whisperer by Nicholas Evans. Now that was a really popular bestseller. It's, you know, it's not literary fiction by any stretch of the imagination. I wonder if anyone under the age of 25 knows this book or knows of Nicholas Evans. He was a huge best-selling author, very, very popular. I think that book was made into a film. It was Robert Redford. But yeah, he's one I don't think would make onto a best books of the 20th century list now. Number 99, I, Claudius by Robert Graves, a personal favourite of mine. Number 98, Earthly Powers by Anthony Burgess. Number 97, The BFG by Roald Dahl. And I can tell you, Roald Dahl has 4 books on this list. Number 96, The Van. The Van is part of the Barrytown trilogy by Roddy Doyle, the most famous book of which is The Commitments. All 3 are great. Number 95, High Fidelity by Nick Hornby, which I also love, but was it a book of the moment, of the time? But it's a great book. Number 94, Cry, the Beloved Country by Alan Paton. Number 93, The Alexandria Quartet by Lawrence Durrell. Number 92, Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton, which is a book that is very well loved. And 1990s Jurassic Park, the movie, came out and was one of the most amazing, stunning visual things I'd ever seen, because it was the first time we'd seen any effects in that kind of way. It just blew our minds. And the book then, I think, became, I mean, it was a great bestseller anyway, but I think became more popular off the back of it. I've since read it. It's a great book. Very different from the film. Not very different, but it is different from the film. Much more violent, but a great book nonetheless. Would it make it onto a list of the best books of the 20th century now? I don't know. Number 91, our first non-fiction, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. Number 90, Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. I remember that coming out in the 90s, and a very important book. Number 89, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Now, you have to forgive me for pronouncing this author's name, but I think it's Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I may have pronounced that wrong. Number 88, The Tin Drum by Gunter Grass. Number 87, science fiction, 2001: A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke. Number 86, Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell. Number 85, The Rainbow by D.H. Lawrence. Number 84, An Evil Cradling by Brian Keenan. Number 83, Delia's Complete Cookery Course by Delia Smith. If you are not from the UK, you might not know who Delia Smith is, but she was probably like our first and most well-beloved TV cook, and her Complete Cookery Course was a very, one of those, iconic cookery books. So Delia's Complete Cookery Course. I find that interesting because I haven't seen a cookery book on either of those lists from the New York Times. Number 82, The Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe. Number 81, Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. Very controversial, one of the banned books in the UK. Number 79, A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. You'll notice the lights changed because I just had to stop and put the lights on. Number 78, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter S. Thompson. Number 77, American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. A very controversial book, but would it make it onto the 20th century list now? I don't know. I mean, is it still read? Do people still read American Psycho? It was just a book of the moment back then, for sure. Number 76, and my personal favourite Roald Dahl book, Matilda. Number 75, another Roddy Doyle, Paddy Clark, ha ha ha. So 2 Roddy Doyles on this list. He was, still very popular. I mean, he still is a very popular author, but very popular back then in the 90s. I think that was kind of the height of his influence and reach, really. Number 74, All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque. Then number 73, Stephen King, The Stand. Number 72, The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene. Number 71, my personal favourite Stephen King book, It, is at number 71. So Stephen King had 2 books on this list. He has 1 book on the Reader's New York Times list, which is 11/22/63, which I completely agree with. I love that book. Number 70, Lucky Jim by Kingsley Amis. Number 69, E.M. Forster's first book on the list, A Room with a View. Number 68, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert M. Pertzig. Does anyone talk about the book anymore? People used to buy it a lot. Number 67, Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. Number 66. Now, this is a book that I absolutely love, and I don't see people reading it or talking about it anymore. I think the film put paid to it because it was awful, but it's a brilliant, brilliant book, and I don't know if it would make a Best Books of the 20th Century list now, but is very much of the time, and it is Captain Corelli's Mandolin by Louis de Bernier, which, if you've never read it, do. If you like historical fiction, if you like something clever, if you want something to tug at the heartstrings but also make you laugh, that is a very good book. Number 65, The French Lieutenant's Woman by John Fowles. Number 64, Tales of the City by Armistead Maupin. Number 63, The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. Number 62, The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist by Robert Tressel. Number 61, Brighton Rock by Graham Greene. Number 60, The Magus by John Fowles. That's 2 books by John Fowles on the list. Number 59, a very important book, Testament of Youth by Vera Brittain, her non-fiction account of being a nurse in World War I. Very important book. Number 58, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I'm glad to see Margaret Atwood on here. Number 57, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. Number 56, another book I love, Cider with Rosie by Laurie Lee. Number 55, The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. And I never see people talking about that either. And I tried reading Gormenghast and I didn't get on with it when I was younger, but I think I might do now. Might have to reread that. Number 53, here's another of those books that I think is of the moment, and I don't think it would appear, because who reads this or who remembers this book? And it is Perfume by Patrick Suskind. Now, when I say who remembers it, I think people who read it back then would remember it. I'm just wondering if newer readers like Gen Z, would they know what this book is? Perfume, The Story of a Murderer. Yeah, it's a historical fiction book set in Paris about a murderer who has, I think he's like got obsessions with smells, like he's got a very good olfactory sense. Number 52, A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. Number 51, June by Frank Herbert. So that's the 100 to 51. So now the top 50. Number 50, A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth, which I just finished for the second time and I read for the first time back, probably about the year that this list came out actually, and I think definitely deserves to be on this list. Number 49, Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. Number 48, Howard's End by E.M. Forster. Number 47, Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks. Number 46, The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. I didn't get on with that book. I read it, didn't like it. Number 45, The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. I read that and loved it. Number 43, Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which I also did not get on with. I've tried to read it twice, couldn't. The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco is number 42. Sophie's World, number 41 by Jostein Gaarder, and that book I feel like may have been a book of the time rather than a best book of the 20th century. So I feel like, you know, recent books published recently that were in the forefront of people's minds, those sorts of books I think made it onto this list, that they may not have retained the following that they had back then, but that was a great book, and that was a book about a little girl learning about philosophy, and someone had sent her a series of letters and she learned all about philosophy and different philosophical schools and schools of thought, etc. It was great. Number 40, Watership Down by Richard Adams, definitely needs to be on this list. I love that book. Number 39, A Passage to India by Ian Forster. Number 38, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Number 37, Possession by A.S. Byatt. Number 36, Beloved by Toni Morrison, definitely needs to be on this list, and also a book a lot of people should read. Most people should read that book. It's very harrowing, so it's quite traumatic, but I think it's a really important book. Number 35, Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Number 34, and the top Roald Dahl book on this list, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which is no surprise really. Number 33, In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. Number 32, controversial one, The Wasp Factory by Ian Banks. I really enjoyed The Wasp Factory and a lot of people hate it. And I read it back then, so I don't know if I'd still like it now. Who knows? But yeah, a lot of people hate that book. Number 31, Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, a book I will never read. Ugh, no. Number 30, Survival in Auschwitz by Primo Levi. Number 29, To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. Number 28, Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Number 27, another book I love, A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. Number 26, Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank, another book everybody should read. Number 25, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. Number 24, I'm so pleased this is so high up, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Love that book. Number 22, The Trial by Franz Kafka. Number 21, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. And that is by no means the last children's book on this list, and one of my favourite childhood books as well. Number 20, The Stranger by Albert Camus. Number 19, The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Number 18 is The Colour Purple by Alice Walker, another great book. Number 17 is Winnie the Pooh by A.A. Milne. And number 16 is The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. I couldn't agree more that they are high up in the top 20. I love that. Number 13, The Lord of the Flies by William Golding. Number 12, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Number 11 is Wild Swans, Three Daughters of China by Zheng Chang. That book is brilliant, and that is a non-fiction book about her mother and her grandmother and their experiences in China across the 20th century. So it covers the Cultural Revolution, etc., etc. So really harrowing but important. I think it's a great book. Okay, so we get to the top 10. And at number 10, a book that I think is one of those books, you may disagree with me. You might think, Jack, do you know what? This is a great book and it does deserve to be in the top 10. But I think it's a great book. I do agree it's a great book, but I do think it's a book of the time. I don't see people still talking about this book. Maybe people will rediscover it and talk about it, you know, in years to come. And I'm not saying it's not a great book, but I'm just saying, is it because this list was published in 1997 and this book was published in 1995 and was very well loved at the time? And that is Trainspotting by Irvine Welsh. So that is number 10. So yeah, I just wonder if that just speaks more to the taste of the time and the fact that was recently published. So I also wonder then, does that mean Demon Copperhead would retain its top status for that Reader's Choice list in another 75 years? Who knows? Number 9, The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. The rest of them are less surprising, apart from the top one, which I think caused a lot of controversy at the time, as I've said. Number 7, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. That book, absolutely wonderful. Now, oh yeah, the Gabriel Garcia Marquez at number 8. I couldn't get on with that either. I tried that too. Couldn't get on with it. Number 6, The Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger. Read it, never liked it. Might like it now. I read it when I was young, didn't like it then. Number 5, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. I tried to read it at the time because I looked at this top 10 list at the time, and I remember that was one of the books I was like, oh, I'm going to read that. DNF. Number 4, and this is a book I will never read, Ulysses by James Joyce. And I will never read it because I read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and I hated it. So Ulysses and stream of consciousness writing and experimental literary writing, not for me. So the top three. Number 3 and number 2 are by the same author. So number 3 is Animal Farm by George Orwell, and number 2 is 1984 by George Orwell, which I think is one of the great books of the 20th century without a shadow of a doubt. I love 1984. I used to love Animal Farm. I read it years ago. I haven't read it for a long time. But the book of the 20th century, the one that caused all the controversy, hopefully you've guessed, and I don't need to give you a drum roll, but it is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Critics and people like that, and authors and people who spoke about culture and things like that, they were really, there was an outcry about the fact that the book, and it won by a mile. So I'm going to read you some stats from that article that I found, which I will link in the description box below, so you can go and check out the list. I'll leave a link to the list that's on Goodreads, and I'll leave a link to this article and to another blog post that I found, which is about the popularity of Lord of the Rings, which was posted. This is pre the films coming out. The first Peter Jackson film didn't come out till 2001. So the book had, and it won by a country mile. Like, I'll tell you the stats on it. So this article says that J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings came first, receiving just over 5,000 votes. And apparently some distance behind, it doesn't state the number of votes, but George Orwell's second and third place books were 1984 and Animal Farm, and they were quite some way behind. So 5,000, 1 in 5 of those 25,000 people, because you could only vote for one book, voted for The Lord of the Rings as the book of the 20th century, which is great because it's genre fiction. Fantasy now has a much bigger following, in part, or in large part, to the Peter Jackson films of The Lord of the Rings. Fantasy reading is not something you do that is kind of shameful and nerdy anymore. People love fantasy. Game of Thrones, all of the fantasy that you see on TV. This was not a thing when we were younger. When I was a fantasy reader back then, and it was a small section in the corner at the back, it wasn't like people weren't casual fantasy readers back then. So the fact that Lord of the Rings, it might not surprise you now that Lord of the Rings was number 1, but the controversy around it, because it was genre fiction, it was fantasy, it was still not regarded as a work of literature in its own right, and to have that be voted on what the critics were saying is a popular list, it's not to be taken seriously. What do these people know? But now, all these years later, we know that fantasy is a respected genre to write in, and yeah, it's well respected. The Lord of the Rings is the archetype for fantasy and everything that came after it. You have to get into the mindset of what it was like to read fantasy in the 90s to understand the absolute shock at this for the people who felt they knew literature and knew books. So, but it made me, in my little nerdy fantasy reader heart at the time, very, very happy. Some other facts from this: 13 of the top 100 books on the list were by women, only 13. And it said that there was no poetry on the list. And I don't know if there was any poetry on the New York Times list. Someone let me know if there was, I don't know. That there are 2 science books, which were Stephen Hawking's book and Richard Dawkins' book. Children's books were popular choices on this list. As you can see, there were children's books scattered throughout the top 100. And Galen Strawson, who teaches philosophy at Oxford University, said, "The Waterstones list has more than merely sociological interest, yet it doesn't tell us what we should read. Some of the books have been subjected to the test of time and some have not. Will Trainspotting, for instance, be there in 10 years' time?" Which is kind of what I was saying, really, but it's an interesting thing to debate, right? And for instance, I definitely know Harry Potter will appear on a Best Books of the 20th Century list. It has to. It had such a cultural and phenomenal impact. So yeah, I think that would go on there. It wouldn't be my choice for it. I would still pick The Lord of the Rings as the book of the century for me. Not only do I love that book and love that world, but it started a whole genre which has just enriched and made my life so immeasurably happy that yeah, that book, the impact of that book culturally and personally for me cannot be underestimated. So yeah, that would still be my number 1 book of the century. Oh, the other thing I've got to say, there was another article, and the other article was around the popularity of Tolkien ahead of the Lord of the Rings films coming out, and they cited this poll and the fact that it won the best book of the century, of the 20th century. And what they also said, which was really interesting, was they had a quote from a reporter, And this was the quote. It kind of sums up the reaction for some people of this being chosen as the book of the century. In January 1997, reporter Susan Jeffries of the Sunday Times in London informed a colleague that J.R.R. Tolkien's epic fantasy, The Lord of the Rings, had been voted the greatest book of the 20th century in a readers' poll conducted by Britain's Channel 4 and the Waterstone's bookstore chain. Her colleague responded, "Oh hell, has it? Oh my God, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear." Which is also a very British response, I think. But it just shows you the kind of responses that came out, because serious readers of the time did not read fantasy, did not read Tolkien. It's how much has changed now. So that was really interesting. If you enjoyed this video and you want to support the channel and you like the sound of any of these books and you're thinking you're going to buy them, you might want to try using my referral link. I've got one for Books Please, an online book retailer. If you use Spread Book Joy at checkout, you get 5% off. So if you fancy buying any of these books of the 20th century, feel free to use my link, because it also helps out the channel. I get a tiny percentage at no cost to you. So were you right? What did you think of it? If you have any thoughts on this list, on the New York Times list, if you want to do your own video about the list, if you're a booktuber, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this 1997 list. If you've got any ideas about other lists that would be interesting to look at and talk about, then by all means, let's get into it in the comments, and hopefully I will see you again here soon. Bye.